Welcome to the mixtape with Scott. I'm the host, Scott Cunningham, professor of economics at Baylor University. And in this week's episode, I had the honor of interviewing famed applied microeconomist, Dr. Richard Blundell. Dr. Richard Blundell is the David Ricardo Professor of Political Economy at the University of College London, or UCL. Dr. Blundell has made many seminal contributions to a range of areas in economics, including microeconometrics with panel data, labor economics as field, and public economics. He's, to many, a real legend. He's a very productive man, filled with an interesting life story that I thought many of you would find interesting also. As always, as you know, I hope that these stories are useful for you as you listen without judgment and just hear Dr. Blundell tell bits and pieces of his life story. I continue to believe that when we are successful with navigating our lives, one of the things that helps is friendships. One of the things that helps is family. One of the things that helps is our own mental toughness. But one of the things that also helps is the stories of other people. And as you've heard me say, I think in professions and careers of science and commerce, and in economics in general, it's the stories of people's personal lives that helps a lot. No matter how different people seem from us, the oxygen that we need for breathing underwater, I think lots of times comes from hearing anybody's story, listening closely, having consideration towards people. Lots of times is not really so-called being kind, but just being present and allowing their story to affect you. What we learn when that happens is that people are marvelous. In the process of losing sight of ourselves, I think our own heavy weights can sort of drift away. We realize that we're all connected, not so different from one another at all. When we're close, we can sometimes even hear, for reasons that are hard to explain, hear our own stories too. So thank you for Dr. Blundell for sitting down with me. And I'm going to turn it over to myself and I sitting down to talk with the David Ricardo Professor of Political Economy at UCL, Richard Blundell. Well, this is a pleasure to meet someone that I've only read, and this is our first time to actually talk, I think so. This is Dr. Richard Blundell at UCL. Thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure, Scott.
Can you, for the sake of the listener, will you say your full title? And I don't think I pronounced your name correctly. Your full title and where you work?
Yeah, okay. I'm Richard Blundell. I'm professor of economics at UCL, and I'm also a research fellow at the Institute of Fiscal Studies. They're two different places which I've been associated a long time.
Oh, okay. All right, that's cool. I'll ask about that later. Well, before we get started, let's do an icebreaker. What's a vacation that you took maybe as a kid or as a young person that, it may not have been your favorite vacation, but it was something that every now and then you still think about?
Oh, good question. Okay, okay. There are many of those, but let me pick on a road trip while I was an undergraduate. So I think of still young, in the early 70s, around Southern Europe, which was very different. Remember. And it was kind of a great experience because remember, Spain was a dictatorship, Portugal was a dictatorship, Greece was a dictatorship. And in those days, we didn't do internships or anything. As soon as classes were done, we got an old car together and drove as far south as possible. And it was pretty impressive and impressed me. I think it was the first time I'd really fallen in love with the whole of Europe. We drove right from Greece, right through the whole of Southern Europe, all the way over to Portugal. And so that's one thing. So that's the good thing. The other thing was, it cemented my my distaste for authoritarian
For
regimes.
dictator.
Yeah, and at the time, everywhere I went, people of my age were getting ready for the revolution, and I thought, of course, they were highly optimistic. But within about 3 years, in every one of those countries, they'd all turned over to democracy, which was impressive, and I've never really forgotten that. And of course, the 50 years that have followed have been quite impressive in that sense too across Europe.
I bet that's cast a big shadow over you then. That experience sounds pretty profound.
Yeah, I think so. Since then I've always loved traveling. I've liked the interaction of politics and life. Also
Yeah.
realize you like a place even if it's under authoritarianism.
Right, exactly.
But you might prefer not to be there, and you can see how it might be improved. And
Yeah.
those places have come, economically, socially, in every way.
Yeah.
They've really moved, and it's been an exciting era, I think. And so, yeah, that has had a long-term effect on the way I think.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. The only thing we have in comparison in the United States is the slavery experience and the race relations, because I grew up in the South. And
Yeah.
so in the South is I wouldn't say, I mean, I love the South because it's my home, but I wouldn't say when I drove by Mississippi that I think, oh wow, it's just a thriving economy. Um, but I mean, I guess that's the difference. Partly the difference in U.S. and Europe is just this so much so much diversity of these countries. It's so neat.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, whenever I've traveled around the US, I realize it's difficult to describe it as one single
that's
country.
true.
It's many.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
And
that's right. We'll see how many there are this fall when we vote. Well,
exactly.
so tell me where you grew up. Where did you grow up?
I grew up on the south coast of the UK, in near a town called Brighton, which was a pretty good place to grow up, right near the beach. A lot
Is there a
of
famous poem or something about Brighton? Lord Byron?
Brighton. Well, there's a famous book, Brighton Rock, which
Oh,
Graham.
Brighton Rock.
It's a cool place to grow up, in fact, because there was as a teenager, there's the excitement of the 60s. There's
Oh, yeah.
famously the rockers, yeah, the mods and rockers had their battles on the street fronts of Brighton. So you either drove a Lambretta or you drove a Triumph. Actually, over that period, I had both a Lambretta and a Triumph. So
Oh, wow.
maybe this
Triumph, the
characterizes me. I
motorcycle.
don't
Triumph
go.
motorcycle? Yeah, the Triumph
Yeah,
motorcycle.
Triumph 350. Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's beautiful. That's
Yeah.
beautiful. You still drive one of those into the office now?
I cycle into the office now.
You
Yeah,
cycle, you
yeah.
did. You went in a different direction.
That's right.
Wait,
Yeah.
so when you were younger, uh, so where were you in relations to the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and that
Uh,
emerging music?
yeah.
You're younger?
Yeah, I'm younger than them by quite a bit, really. So I'm 70, coming up to 72 there.
Oh, okay.
Nearly 10 years older. But they were highly, that, of course, they were highly influential.
Yeah.
And at that time, of course, music was everything. And it was
Yeah.
everything to me. So
Right.
we all wanted to be rock and roll stars.
Right, sure. The well, so what did your parents do for a living?
Yeah, they were from that generation. They left school at 14. They were pretty smart and, lots of books and lots of great upbringing, but no, very little education. That's not
Oh,
uncommon from that generation. Remember, the UK was highly uneducated. Even when I went to university, there would be around 10% of people going to university or less, in fact, and mainly from the upper echelons of society. So the move to what it is now, which is around 50%, has been very dramatic. And it happened much later. As you know, it's happened across Europe, happened much later than in the US, which is a kind of interesting feature of
yeah, yeah.
of what's happened. So that was so not much kind of direction in terms of education and academia, but a lot of interest in discussion and those kinds of things.
Were you a bit of an outlier going to college, even amongst your
Um,
peers?
Yeah, my brother also went to college, so we're not outliers. We're outliers relative to everything else, but we both did, the college thing. In fact, he's a professor at Cambridge, and I'm a professor here, so it worked out fine for us.
Right.
But yeah, it was not our expectation to go to college. It worked out that way, and it was, in fact, when I was at school, I went to college as an engineer, in fact,
Oh,
as a sound engineer, because I wanted to do acoustic engineering, because I wanted to redesign music venues, so
really? So music's in your
that's
bones.
the influence of Brighton. Economics came much later.
That was a second. That was a plan B. Wait, so
Exactly.
music's really been in your bones for a long time.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, huh.
No, it's important.
What were
It
you
becomes,
listening?
go
Go
on.
ahead.
No, it's if you're an academic, you need something else, I think,
Yes,
to
that's
survive.
right.
And
Right.
as you know, and many people you've interviewed, I'm sure, have something else that really keeps them,
Yeah.
sane. And music does that. Always done that for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
You, you
Well,
know, it.
sorry, go ahead.
No,
Well, so
you.
in high school, what were the bands that you were listening to?
Yeah, they were, both sides of the Atlantic. It was the 60s, so, it's going to be Beatles and Stones and Kinks and all that here.
Yeah.
And, whether it was Dylan and follow-ups,
Oh.
Jeff Sarah playing all those. I should say that I've got this very strong kind of jazz and folk interest too. So I grew up partly listening to Coltrane and all those people, Miles
Oh.
Davis, partly from that's what we did in our family.
That was even how your parents were? Even your parents
He's
were like that?
more my brother, but yeah, music
Huh.
was important to us, so
Wow.
it always
Wow.
has been.
That's
So that's
great. Yeah. Did you play any instruments?
yeah. I had a band.
Oh, you had a
You know,
band?
maybe you don't want to go into that. It's
Oh, no,
certainly,
that's we got. I want to
as
hear
you
a
know,
little bit about that. What was what kind of
yeah,
band
yeah,
did you
yeah.
have? What did you play in
Yeah,
the band?
I played guitar and saxophone actually, so I
Oh,
flipped between both of those. As you can imagine, I'm Ricardo, professor here. I've realized the point of comparative advantage, and you know, in that sense, it was good to stay as my hobby and not my living. But yeah, of course, I play guitar, still do,
oh,
and
that's great.
it's a lot of fun. Yeah, in
Oh,
those guys, when you're a kid, you can spend a lot of
yeah,
time doing that. You spend
yeah.
like hours and hours playing music with
Mm.
friends. And at college, we had a great band actually. So
Oh, that's
that was
great. And that was in Brighton. That was in Brighton.
that was in Bristol. I went
That
to
was
the
in
University
Bristol.
of
So that was a
Bristol.
college
Yeah,
band.
college band. That's right.
Okay.
That was when it really took off. Bristol was famous, still is, for engineering. So I went there as an engineer. I came out as an economist, but that's,
Yeah. Was it one of
that
those
that
things
kind
where
of
in
thing
high
happens.
school? Was it one of those things in high school where you had to pick engineering in high school and that's why you went that route?
Not quite, but there was no, in those days, that's true, right? Probably in the US too, there was no economics in high school at a high level. So if you did math and physics and chemistry and things
It
like
was
that, which of
engineering.
course I did, you specialize, and acoustic engineering took my liking. So
Mm.
but basically it's kind of physics and engineering. But it did, it was good, but it didn't fully appeal to me when I got there. So
When you got there,
I
when you
started.
started taking the classes, acoustic engineering wasn't doing
That's
it for
right.
you?
Yeah. Well, like many undergraduates, and I'm sure it happens here. I got there, and the actual acoustic engineering part of the engineering was closed for the year because I guess the guy was on sabbatical. And I'm sure that happened to everyone.
It was one
But
guy.
but I didn't like that at all. So
The other parts, yeah.
and you can move around those things. In fact, I think in a bar, I met someone who was doing economics. It sounded pretty good, and that's the way I get. I should say that guy who persuaded me to do economics ended up switching to dentistry. So which is pretty. As I tell people, some people find pulling teeth more fun than economics. So, but
Found him at the right time, though. If you had found him a year later, you might be a
exactly.
dentist.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so he's the influence. He's the natural experiment that finds you.
It's kind of true. It's kind of true. Yeah, that's right. Although one thing at Bristol that was good, not that it's particularly relevant, but it was a brilliant group of statisticians. So the degree there was economics and statistics, which is where the econometrics come from. And it was very easy if you were good at math to get into that course, and that was terrific. So
there was econometrics. You were already starting to see this interest in econometrics as a college student.
I think statistics, and economics, the combination. There was some econometrics, but it was more, distributions. There's a famous guy there, Keith Ord, who's a brilliant statistician, actually wrote a book called Families of Distributions, and I thought that was brilliant. So just thinking through distributions, was and those kind of things influence you a long time. The things you then now I can look at I can think as through different distributions quite easily, and that's kind of handy if you're doing any kind of econometrics actually. So that was very helpful. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So what are the econ classes? Was it labor? Did the labor classes catch you when you were an undergrad? I say that because you go into labor in public.
Yeah, no, that comes later. After because I went. It's true. Undergraduate here is you specialize very quickly. So I'm doing a lot of economics, but it's largely econometric statistics, micro. I quite like micro theory at that time.
You did, okay.
So that was pretty good. Enough to get me into the masters at LSE, which is if you talk to anyone who's of my generation or younger, you'll find that was a very influential masters. It still is, but the masters in econometrics and math econ was like a pretty high level, bit like a PhD courses would be now, and that was highly influential. So that's
what were the classes? What were the econometrics professors that made a big influence on you at LSE?
That would be LSE. So the main influence is a guy you might have heard from, a very fine economist, Irish, and a character called Terence Gorman. You may not have heard of him, but he was someone who wrote about consumer theory and empirical work on consumers. So he's the guy who kind of, let's say, invented separability, weak separability, all these things that you use in consumer decision making, which I found incredibly interesting, actually. So and squared up with empirical analysis of what people do. So he was, and he's a great character. A wonderful character. So I think he interviewed me, and I got to know him extremely well. Fine Irish character.
He's still alive.
No, he passed. He passed 20 years ago. In fact, when I came to UCL, I got him to. It was a pretty fledgling group we had here, so I got it. He was at Oxford by then, and he would come in 2 or 3 days a week actually, and he was very influential on the group of colleagues and the group we built here. So in fact, we have our annual lecture here is called the Gorman Lecture, and it's all about tribute to him really, and the way it affected. In those days, remember, in the UK, microeconometrics and empirical micro was kind of unusual. It's a little bit less so than it would have been in the US, and even in the US, in the mid mid 70s, that would have been still fairly unusual because access to data was so poor. And but you're coming up to the first microdata revolution where you suddenly get access to fantastic panel data and cross-section data, the pre-admin and administrative register data, but the first wave, which was a fantastically important wave. Actually, it's where all the panel data work came out, and there was a lot of excitement there. So there was a guy there, a young guy called Steve Nicol, who's not so young, he's older than me. He's a well-known labor economist and econometrician, and he taught, I think it was his first job at LSE, so he was also influential. It was a great group, by the way. There's Saga and there's Durbin, Watson Test, they're all on the faculty there. So that was the things you learn, you don't realize it at the time, but the things you get out there, you keep, and I can still do all that stuff.
A lot of econometrics for a master's program. LSE was very, wow. How many years?
You could focus. Remember, it was called Econometrics and Mathecon. So you'd have a set like Frank Hahn, all the guys in Mathecon. If you wanted to do that, it's where I picked up duality theory from Gorman and that, which also is very influential. But apart from duality and thinking about decision making, it was more the econometrics. Yeah, it is a terrific background. Yeah.
Well, so am I wrong that I couldn't find a PhD? Did you do a PhD?
No, I didn't. It was
you went straight from the Master's of Science to a job.
Yeah. Well, it was a good master, by the way.
It was a good master.
It wasn't so unusual, but so Gorman, the guy I've just told you I loved and influential, Gorman, actually wanted to supervise me, but one characteristic of Gorman was brilliance but disorganization, and I realized after sitting in Lincoln's Inn Fields, I think, talking about work, which we loved, we did a lot of stuff together. I thought, no, this is not going to work as a PhD. So you could move into jobs at that time. So I took a job in Manchester, which I think it was the third. I think I was interviewed at York, Warwick, and Manchester, and third time lucky, but I was a youngster.
So you went to Manchester as a faculty member?
I did, as a lecturer. Lecturing econometrics as in those days, departments. I didn't think that was a good idea, by the way, but they had separate econometrics departments from economics.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Indeed, at LSE too. That changed, and I think that was a change for the good, but much more integrated these days. But hopefully they are. But it was a separate. There was a guy, if you've ever come across Johnson's Econometrics, Jack Johnson. It's a book from the 70s. You may have come across econometric methods. I think it's a little inferior to Art Goldberger's book of similar time, which I preferred. But Johnson's book was a very popular one and pretty good. He was a great guy, so he was the kind of chair of econometrics there. But I must say, when I got there, he thought the UK was turning to socialism and decided he should leave for North America. I even at that point I said, I don't really see this, and it turned out I was right, because a year later Thatcher was elected, which was hardly a move to socialism, but a few people left at that time, and a few people left after Thatcher was elected too. But that was a good experience. Sometimes doing things on your own is pretty good. And remember, there wasn't too much microeconometrics, so I'm drawing off McFadden, Jim Heckman, Jerry, all those guys that were very influential in the early days of microeconometrics, and people here too. And you might as well just draw on it yourself as much as do a PhD. I wouldn't recommend people not do a PhD anymore, but there are other ways of learning stuff, and it was fun to do it that way at the time.
So you leave LSE about 75, is that right?
Yeah.
And that's when you start at Manchester? You start at Manchester?
Yeah. 23 years old.
23 years old. Wow. And so straight out with a master's, it's just that LSE is essentially pushed a doctorate almost into that
Yeah.
master's pretty much,
Yeah, the
right?
course, even now, the course is at a good doctorate, like the one we got here or at LSE, or, it's pretty much at that level. There was
Right.
probably a little less real analysis and maybe some other, things you would get now. There was less game theory then, but
Right.
that's more history. That's more history of how things have developed rather
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
so
Right.
it was pretty rigorous. It was good. Yeah.
Well, so, okay, well, I was going to ask, now this is an awkward question because I don't know how to ask it, but I was going to say, well, what was your education like at LSE compared to the kinds of education you've overseen at UCL or other places? But it's like, one's a doctorate, one's a master's, but still, what was different about it that people
Yeah.
would be surprised about?
Yeah. Well, remember here, everybody does a master's before a doctorate. So it's not
Uh,
so, that was true then. And many people left, the masters I was on would have gone to the US for a PhD or stayed around in the UK for a PhD. But there are plenty of people, certainly a few years old ahead of me, who didn't do PhDs at all. Steve Nicol, for example,
mhm.
my colleague Andrew Cheshire, the econometrician, I think he was hired straight out of a BSc, not even a master's, and
Wow.
he's a pretty smart guy. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but masters have kind of dominated the scene in the UK. It's almost at one point we cornered the market, I think you could say. So a master's from LSE, from the MPhil at Oxford, the MSc here at UCL was really still are booming, by the way, and there are there's a huge number of students on them, and they're a great source of of interacting with students and developing with students. So you get hundreds of students on these courses, and then a small group will go on to a PhD, maybe 20 or 30 of them out of 100, say. And so it's a kind of pre-way into a doctorate. It
Mhm.
works. I still think it works pretty good. I always remember being surprised that people in the US were going straight into a doctorate out of a BSc or BA.
Mhm.
And of course, now it would be typical not to do that and to do some pre-doc or something like that, or some internship. And I
Mhm.
think there's a little bit of maturity before you start a PhD
Yeah,
is
yeah.
not a bad idea.
Sure. Well,
Yeah.
so when do you get these interests in labor and public finance? Was it at LSE or does it happen later? Because I guess you graduate as you're like an actual a microeconometrician, but
Yeah.
you already are an applied econometrician focusing because you mentioned Heckman. You're focused on
Yeah.
labor.
Yeah. Not just labor. So I think I've always been more interested in just the household behavior, actually. And, so that interacts with labor, it interacts with public finance,
Yeah,
and it interacts with, a whole set of things
whole
around
set of things. Yeah.
studying families, dynamics, all those things. So
Mhm.
I kind of like that. I was drawing off, people doing discrete choice, people doing panel data dynamics, all those things all came together. Then and so I never think of myself as a labor economist. I think I do labor economics, but I also look at public finance and econometrics. And at that time, it was the intersection was pretty exciting, I should say, and I think it has stayed that way, but particularly in those days, we were coming across our first sets of real panel data, being able to study dynamic behavior of
Yeah.
households, labor markets, all those things. And in some sense, there were a lot of low hanging fruit to be
Yeah.
picked, and we
Right.
all
Right.
picked
Right.
at them.
So what were some low hanging fruit back then that like, and why were they like, top of mind for somebody interested in consumer theory
Yeah, it was.
or household behavior?
Yeah, good question. I think the we were at the beginnings of dealing with heterogeneity properly in
Yeah.
econometrics and study. Remember, up to that point, everything was cross-section, and a lot of the low-hanging fruit was in that. How do you've got a cross-section. This is going to sound a bit boring, but you've got a cross-section and you want to think dynamics. How do you do that? So, one of the first things that I did was, can you kind of use some ideas from theory to condition on some outcomes to get things that are consistent with dynamic behavior, even if you're just looking at cross section. So that all that life cycle consistent or conditioning on savings. So are the variables that you think are going to summarize the future kind of well? And now that sounds simple these days, but it was an innovation, and it was kind of easy to publish that type of work at the time because it was new. And there was, plenty of interest, whether it was on investment or consumer behavior over time, just how to think about dynamics generally. If we have a tax reform, then how does the evolution of behavior follow, whether it's investment of firms or labor demand or consumer behavior. So that kind of drew me in to thinking public finance. The big policy concerns at that time were, as they, I think, should be and still are, around the bottom of the distribution and how you deal with inequality. And so that stayed with me all the time.
Yeah. It must be really exciting to have did you say you have the Ricardo chair?
Yeah. The oldest chair. It's the
Wow.
oldest chair of economics in England because we're the oldest of England. I can't say the UK because we're beaten by Glasgow, which of course has the famous Adam Smith.
Right.
But in England, in fact, we're coming up for 200 years. So what happened was Ricardo was a brilliant person and a brilliant economist. And he founded the stock exchange in London, apart from many other things. And he died relatively young, and he left some money to found the department here. And it was Bentham was the founder of UCL, of course, and 200 years ago. And what happened was he went around asking people, is this a good idea? There's some great letters. I've got one where he's writing to Say. Say was a very famous French economist. And he says, my dear Professor Say, do you think it's a good idea that we have a chair of a political economy? Of course, it was called then because that was the field. A chair of political economy at UCL. And he writes back saying, bravo, this is a wonderful idea, my dear Bentham. And that was, and then he had the money from Ricardo to found it, and that's where it started. And,
wow.
Well, so it's a great chair to have.
That's a great chair to have, and I don't have it in front of me, but like he's got this opening paragraph for the principles of political economy, and it's basically like something about essentially that the most important work is to understand the rules that govern the allocation of the resources that come from the land and all this stuff. And it's, public finance. And then you're in public finance and you're got Ricardo's chair. It just must be really surreal.
It's good. Yeah. No, it's cool. And it's a great economy. I think there's some quote where I think Dave Donaldson actually has it in his paper on comparative advantage, where Paul Samuelson's saying what give me someone's asking Samuelson what's the biggest great idea in economics, and he says comparative advantage.
That's great.
Of course it's easy to say, it's quite difficult to prove the importance of comparative advantage. I think it took another 150 years for anyone to do that empirically, but the idea is good.
It is good. So I recently wrote this history of diff and diff, and it was difference and differences, and it was not really like a history per se, as it was more like what was the evolution of the papers. I was trying to understand the evolution of the papers. And
Mm.
and I used Google Scholar, and I was using, when does diff and diff appear with certain words like parallel
Oh yeah,
trends or event
yeah.
study. And what was really interesting in doing this was seeing how often you came up in this like history.
Mm.
Like for instance, you have these two papers with Monica Costa
Sure.
Diaz,
Yeah. Yes.
evaluation
Yeah.
methods
Yeah.
for non-experimental
Yeah.
data, alternative approaches to evaluation in empirical micro.
That's
And I was like looking at it, and I just was wondering, when you become this maybe proponent's not the right word, but you become this like spokesman almost of explaining the evaluation methods for non-experimental data, uh, and almost seem ahead of your time. I mean, obviously, it's like coming out of Princeton and Harvard and stuff, but it's like you're sort of bringing it and really being very careful in the econometrics and writing down what assumptions are going to be used for this difference in differences and having very influential work. And I just was curious, you know, uh, I wouldn't associate that. You said earlier, that you were reading a lot of McFadden when you were in
mm.
grad school. So I wouldn't associate that with this kind of empirical labor. So I just was curious, what was all that about for you?
Yeah. A good question. Well, I've never been religious about methods, as you probably
Mm,
realize, because you know, and I like answering questions,
right.
not trying to figure out something without a question first. So, and for lots of questions, that kind of analysis is what you want to do. You do it automatically. So, I think the way I was getting it when I wrote those papers was just for me and with students. That was a
Mm,
course to begin with. I've written a lot where we were using, if you are going to want to build a structural model for counterfactuals, you know, you can't do counterfactuals without a structural model, but you
yep.
want to make sure it all fits as best you can with a set of policy reforms you've seen. Then the cleanest thing to do is to figure out some kind of quasi experimental method, and diff and
Mm,
diff was the diff and diff's been around a long time. I do attribute it though to Orley and David Card, and Orley was also I got this job when I got this job at UCL. I was visiting Princeton, and I got the call about a job at UCL and come over. So I came over immediately for. In those days, that interviews, not seminars, so they do it with the provost. That's the way. That's the way. The bizarre old way that we do it here. We don't. We've got better since then, but yeah, I was sitting in a seminar. I remember that well actually
uh,
because I was sitting in a seminar. There was Orley and Angus. David was still, I think he was just finishing his PhD.
so
Does that
yeah,
make
like
sense? Yeah, I
early
think it might make
early
sense.
70s.
Or maybe on there is a young,
Yeah.
Whitney was a young faculty member. Whitney knew him. I'm going to get some of this wrong, so, but largely right.
Yeah.
And so it already, I learned a lot from Orley and David and the Princeton group. I've always mixed and matched. In fact,
Yeah.
I never really, some people get driven by, argument and rivalry. I kind of like putting things together. And
Mm,
and I know there's plenty of people that are driven to creativity by, arguing and going one tribe or another, but that's never been my motivation. So
mm,
right from early on, I was interested in how you might use these methods, and diff is incredibly powerful because, in fact, I remember Richard Freeman, David, and I did a little book. Actually, it was part of a kind of review called how to make Britain a premier economy. So we went around talking to people about what policies. This is at the late 90s, and from that I realized that if you want to explain something clearly and get over a point, diff and diff is
different,
beautiful.
yeah.
Of course, my view is it's much harder to, it's really hard to come up with an environment when it really works well. And we've seen this explosion of new papers taking it much further. And generally that's true. But, if you're trying to convince somebody that some policy is really having an impact, we're talking about a time when often it was just time series, and that of course gets you nowhere. So at least having the time series of a comparative group and arguing for comparative trends and all that. Yeah, I thought it was convincing, and I've always tried to get people to look at all these things and choose the one that's most appropriate for their question, and still do that, Scott. That's the way I think.
Well, this paper with Stephen Bond on initial conditions and moment. It has 30,000 sites since it was published in 98. It is amazing. And I'm just curious if you would just share a little bit about what that paper's about, but also how was that paper born? What was the origin story of that paper?
Yeah. So this is about the micro group that it was a very exciting time. You're talking about late 80s and early 90s. That paper came out in 98, but in fact the work was done in the early 90s. That was the time we had access through the Institute of Fiscal Studies, where policy and empirical policy work is the kind of key. And I just founded the research group there, and we got a big amount of money to have a centre in public empirical analysis, public policy, really, you could say. And so there was a lot of interest in that, and I had 2 or 3 very talented people around. There was Manuel Arellano, who has just finished his PhD at LSE, I think it was at Oxford. Steve, his first job, Steve Bond, was at IFS. And Costas Magear, actually, and a few others were all around. We were all looking at aspects of panel data. And it was as simple as this, because what happened was as you know, the natural thing, if you want, if you've got the 2 absolutely kind of key things that drive endogeneity, and when we're thinking about it, you've got individual heterogeneity and correlation there, and you've got correlated transitory shocks or current period simultaneity. So how are you going to deal with that? Everybody's answer, if you look back at that era, including Stephen Manuel's, and a lot of us, was to difference, because we've got panel data. That's the transformation that gets out. The problem with differencing, and then of course you want to deal with endogeneity, so you're going to find an instrument. The problem with differencing is many things have approximately unit root, and they're very hard to predict. And so the first stage on trying to get an instrument to predict a difference has usually got extremely low power. And in fact, what we found was, we were getting a lot of kind of finite sample bias, you could say, just a lot of small sample bias, even from consistent estimated, broadly speaking, coming from weak instruments, just not enough. The argument there was, the instruments we're using often were lags. A lot of people don't like using lags as instruments, but, a lot of the time you're thinking, I've differenced out the individual effect. What's left is, is the shocks that are hitting the process, but they've got some kind of limited dependence. And of course, if that's true, that's always true in some theory, and many people, but broadly speaking, it's going to be fine. And so under some transformation, history of different things, including policies, of course, can be good instruments. But if the thing is it's a random walk, it's hard to predict. So it's that kind of idea. And then we kind of got that paper was in one afternoon. We said, surely there's something else we can do, so we started with stationarity, and then with stationarity, you get more moments. And a lot of those moments looked like you were still using the level of the model, but you were using things like differences as instruments. So, and the first application was production function, and bizarrely, it's still often used for production functions, because they're, heterogeneity is key. You think there's some unobservable unobservable technical change causing shock. So, you want to do both these. You want to get rid of the heterogeneity, the level heterogeneity if you want, and you want to get rid of the simultaneity that's coming from the concurrent technological shocks you're not seeing. That's obviously going to be correlated with labor and capital choices. So, that's where you think of, what transformations can I do where I still get some powerful GMM or IV type results. What moments are I going to use? And it all came down to, well, if you make enough conditions on the initial condition, you can get these things to work. Stationarity is one. You can be weaker than that. And they're fairly weak conditions. And then suddenly you get much more robust, powerful results. And they're quite powerful, even if the process is getting close to a unit root. They can give you much more precision. So that caught on. I mean, we literally, you can never tell what's going to be a successful paper. That was an idea developed over time, but put together one afternoon at IFS, and it's been very successful.
How did you
get citations?
It's been incredible. I mean, when did you first notice that it was being impactful? Did you notice you were working on it for many years?
Yeah. Well, one thing that's been picked up by many people, because remember in that, investment models, consumption models, but particularly investment models and production functions were being, there's a lot of data out there where people were trying to figure those things out. And suddenly, thanks partly to Steve Bond writing this up in Gauss, which was what everybody used. Or, there was a program there, which of course there's many in Stata now, and are, I think. But people would use it. And so right early on in the, by the mid-90s, there was late 90s, the ideas were being used a lot and we were getting a lot of citations even then. What's been remarkable is that they've just, it stayed reasonably influential, and that's a nice thing to see, of course.
That's incredible. That must feel, how does that feel to think about that? One day, but also many years has turned out to just been so valuable to so many people and so impactful.
It's good. I mean, one thing. So recently, you might have seen this. Anyway, I'm going to say that. So Journal of Econometrics did this, 50th anniversary, and they picked the most cited paper of each of a decade, and ours was the most cited paper in the 90s. So we just looked back on it. We kind of republished and then did a little think through what it's done. And one thing that really surprised me, I didn't realize this, it's used a lot outside regular economics. So you see it, a lot of citations in a much broader literature, in right across all kinds of literature, in kind of management, in right across kind of business, finance, and even other parts of social science. So that's also a kind of interesting thing. I think if you are lucky enough to get a method that people pick up on, then it's like a gold mine, really. And it's nice to see.
Did it change your life, do you think, at all? Did it change your career? Made you switch what kinds of topics you worked on or anything like that?
Not really, no.
Not really.
No, I mean, I work on, the things I know, which is, trying to figure out, behavior and what parameters we need to make, to get public policy working better. And, so that's just one part of the microeconometric toolbox, I guess, which is continues to be developed in a pretty exciting way, I think. I mean, it's still, as you're great, the work you've done is really important. It's still very influential, and I think it's made economics a more precise, better, and it's great. Yeah. So no, I flip between methods because sometimes as you probably know, I think that it's important to have the full structural dynamic model sitting there because I want to look at some tax policy and human capital, the only way I can think it through, at least, is to get
Mhm.
all the kind of mechanisms really lined out. And for that,
Yeah,
you just don't. That kind of estimator, diff and diff, is not going to give you everything. It'll give you part of what you need. So
right, right.
it's that's the way I tend to think.
Yeah, yeah. So you're not tribal on the methods, but are you sort of tribal in the sense of being a committed microeconomist, sort of like, you're tribal in that you love consumer theory and you love that kind of work and see that as like, the things that you really find important.
Yeah. I don't really love theory, by the way.
Right.
I love addressing problems, and
Ah,
I find consumer, if there's a logical, it's always difficult, isn't it? You don't want to be constrained by a box you've been thinking in, but it kind of helps consumer theory, dynamic optimization, all those things help think through the way you. I always remember there's a kind of nice comment Steve Nicol made, I think to me, in fact, but he often says it, is that he's looking at all these investment models, and you kind of think the future and dynamics must matter for investment, and none of them had those features, and
mm,
and he was kind of talking to Arrow, I think, and Arrow said, "Oh yeah, but the key thing is think about irreversibility of capital, of investment." And that's a kind of theoretical point, that if you have
mm,
irreversibility, the future immediately matters in the decision making, as does history. That kind of insight, that's the way I tend to like to use theory, that it gives you insights that
mm,
just make a direction for modeling, and
yeah.
then it's into the empirics and getting,
Right.
of course, good data or a good natural experiment.
Right. Right.
Those are what matter.
Well, so
Yeah.
your work on innovation, I'm not trying to jump around, but I actually did not, I'm still trying to get a handle on who your, by like when people look at Dr. Blundell, and if like, if I walk into a room or if I go to Soli or something like that, and they say, well, this is who Richard Blundell is, how are they
Mm.
bringing all this together? Because even this work like on innovation, I wouldn't,
Mm.
it's not as obvious to me that that has to do with household behavior or consumers, but what am I
Mm.
missing? What's that work been about?
Well, it's not household behavior, but it's a key behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah, that comes. I'm a little bit, I kind of respond. I like to work in teams, by the way. So
Yeah.
that early work on innovation was, I had a brilliant PhD student called John Van Reenen, who
Mm,
was, of course, now extremely well known,
mm,
and a colleague here at UCL at the time was Philip Aguillon, and we actually, John then, and we had another student called Nicholas Bloom, so Nick Bloom, both incredibly successful students, probably
yeah.
among the most successful I've had, and we were all kind of excited around the ideas of innovation and investment, and how that might play out, purely because that's a key part of just thinking about productivity, which to me productivity is absolutely kind of fundamental to thinking about how households and incomes evolve. So I really wanted to know about that. And I must say, I hadn't really thought about the way competition works. I wasn't very au fait with Schumpeter and all that. And part of that work was just getting to understand how this idea of you can have too much or too little competition. You
Mm,
want the innovators to innovate, but you don't want them to capture the rents for too long. And
right.
and the idea is that right? Does the world actually look like that?
Yeah.
And so the inverted U paper with Aguillon and Nick and Rachel Griffiths, also a colleague at IFS at that time,
Mm,
is really trying to hone in on that. And up till then, it's amazing to say this, but nobody had really taken microeconometrics to that model. And
right.
so and it's a model about firm decision making and innovation. And the
Oh,
data was suddenly there. We could link up patents with firms, and of course, this is now a very common thing to do. And there are much better models, but I'd still find that very exciting. And of course, in a policy sense, the biggest problem in the UK is that we don't have enough innovation or productivity, so productivity growth. And so I still find that pretty interesting
mm,
field. So I think if you want to ask, there's a set of public policy questions, and then what I like to do is to dive into them with a team of smart people.
yeah,
And so
right,
it's not really households and not
right.
consumer. It's kind of trying to figure out behavior. But you're right. It's a bit of a kind of checkered career if you're trying to nail me as a labor economist, whatever. And I was always reluctant here at UCL to have, which I must say was probably the wrong thing, but I always just wanted an applied group, applied micro. I don't want labor. I don't want to have a labor seminar, a public seminar, nothing of that sort,
Uh,
because we have too much to learn from each other.
uh,
And we still do that, actually.
yeah,
And it kind of works. But, of course, there are labor economists surely do want to work together, and they have, fantastic insights. But I think, it partly came, from what Angus was doing at the time. Development was in a mess at that time, early, I'm talking about 70s, early 80s. And it was interesting how it had become a mess, because the development seminar, wherever you went, was a very inward looking thing, with no econometrics, no people jumping around saying that's probably not right, so
right.
it lacked the excitement of a labor seminar, say. And so if you kind of like development, public, labor, all those different things, which I do, then bringing them together is a fun thing to do. And I still think that's important, but
Mm,
there's limits to that. But there's now an application seminar at LSE. They didn't used to have that, where that once a week the applied micro group basically get together, because methods in labor are clearly absolutely key to things. They've developed faster, but there are methods in IO and development and that are
mm.
also pretty important. So you can learn from one another.
That's the
Yeah,
first
but
time
that's a
I've,
philosophy. That's a kind of philosophy, Scott, and it may not be the best one, but it's worked for me anyway.
yeah, yeah, that's the first time I've thought about applied micro being designed almost to bring more conversation between the fields. That's how you've
Yeah,
always thought about it? You've thought about it like that? Is it's like this is a
absolutely.
way for labor and health to be talking to each other?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
Because
that's
remember, when I started in public, labor was a kind of little slight bit of that, and so
yeah.
you could go to a tax seminar, labor income tax, and the view of the labor market was kind of naive,
Uh-huh.
so, and there wasn't much interest in what wage processes look like, how people behaved. Public had one way of doing it, labor had another way.
Mhm.
And so I think now you would not see that. I think, there's a lot more interaction, but in my view, not enough. I still think that about labor. I think it can be, I think when we ran the World Congress, here you are. I'm drinking from the Solly, the cup, the mug we did for the Society of Labour Economics conference here, which was the World Conference. I was president of the Society of Labour Economics, which is really North American. Steve Machin, who's my colleague here at that time, was the European one. So we ran the World Congress here, and we tried to make it very diverse. I had Becca, we had, Rob Scheimer, we had, Search, we had families. Of course, Josh was here, David was here, and we tried to make Pierre Andre about families. So it was, I thought it was brilliant, but, I don't know how influential that's been, but I think
Wow.
it's always fun to bring people together like that. You
Yeah.
This limit, some things come from very narrow, intense work. Other things come from bringing people together across the empirical micro.
But that
So,
fits a little bit with you saying that you're not tribal.
mm,
You know,
yeah,
you're not
yeah,
tribal, so you're kind of like, you're it sounds like anyway, you're not tribal, you're kind of looking for anything you can learn from anybody.
yeah.
But then you sort
That's
of
right.
see that as
Yeah.
scientifically valuable and it's your personality. Is that right?
Probably. Yeah,
Huh.
both those. I think it's scientifically valuable. I'm not saying it's there are
The only
great
way, right?
scientific documents that were built off pure tribalism. So,
Right.
it's difficult because, you do get tribal when you think, if I want to address this problem, there's a way of doing it. And there is
Right.
only really one way of doing it. And in
Mhm.
that, it be quasi-experimental is the right way, and you don't want all the structure. The question doesn't require that, so why use it? And
Yeah.
actually, if you look back at consumer models, where I started, it was horrible because people would never say what they were actually trying to recover. They'd just estimate something for that sake. So it's being precise about what you want and what you
Mm,
need to do in terms of the methodology or data or theory to be able to do that is the way I like to see it. I
mm.
still like that. Of course, as you ask for more, you make more assumptions, and there's plenty of people who won't who don't want to make those assumptions.
Right.
But
Right.
that's a trade-off.
Yeah,
If you want
sure.
to, and there's plenty of people who've explored that trade-off much more detail than me.
Right.
So I won't
Right. Right.
go
Well,
into.
it's the wrapping up we've been talking for about a little over an hour. I wanted to
Oh,
just
really? How terrible!
I was just wanted to ask you, uh,
Yeah.
well, what is it that really has gotten you out of bed every morning to do this kind of work where, if you didn't have that one thing, you just wouldn't even want to be doing this kind of work? What's really been the incentive for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd like to say it's the question I'm trying to answer, and I do think about that. But I must say, the buzz I get is from working with other people and younger, smarter people, and it's still what draws me into this. So I have great young colleagues here. I work with people elsewhere, and it's the excitement around that and the pleasure about, in my view, of economics, especially applied economics, that's become the way to do it. You bring
Yeah.
people together. It's very exciting. Not quite lab based, which I think can be less exciting. We're talking about 3 or 4 people working intensely together, and that's a pretty exciting thing. And if they're very smart, that can be very uplifting and fantastic experience. It might be in a rock and roll band for that matter. I think
Right.
it's the experience of creating something as a group,
Yeah.
and I kind of like that. So I like that. Yeah, so it's a combination. It's that
Yeah.
plus the question.
You never quit. You never quit your college band. You've just been
Yeah,
changing the music and
yeah,
changing the characters out.
maybe.
Well, it's been so nice to
Right.
talk to you.
Yeah.
I really appreciate
Thanks,
you
Scott.
sitting down with me. I really appreciate it. I
Yeah.
hope we can run into each other one day.
Yeah, come and drop in London if you're around. We can
Okay, next time I'm in London. Now
let's
you've invited me, so I'll do it.
do that. Okay.
Okay, bye
Thanks.
bye.
Great to talk with you. Bye bye.